Whitney, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited that I was invited. I've never been to Memphis before. It's my first time, but I travel a lot, and I love going to new places and new communities and seeing what's going on. And the energy here is so great, and everybody's so positive, so thank you for having me. I'm going to talk today about collecting as a form of cultural stewardship. It's something I'm passionate about. And as Whitney said, I work for Sotheby's, but I don't sell anything. I am on the educational side. I run an MA in contemporary art, and it focuses also on the market. So when I came to Sotheby's to do that, I'd always been a nonprofit person. I'd been living in London for over a decade and done all my graduate school. And I remember calling my friend who's sort of a mentor, and I said, Sotheby's want me to set up an MA program. What should I do? And she said, you're crazy if you think art and money are not related. So get off your art historian ivory tower and get there and learn something. And I have learned that money and art are very interrelated. Also, I think today is an interesting day for me to give this talk because it is a day of marching around the country against gun violence. And I do think we live in times of precarity. It's a word that's being used a lot, especially in New York, where I live. I think people are very nervous about a lot of things, including funding for the arts. And so I'm going to talk to you a bit about some things about the market, and then a couple of collectors, and then a couple of artists, and how each of these things impacts us. So if you think about, if any of you have seen Devil Wears Prada, when Meryl Streep says, to Anne Hathaway, do you think, that Gap sweater has nothing to do with this, haute couture, goatee or whatever? It's all connected. And so kind of think about that today. So I'm just starting here with a quote from Alex Gartenfeld. He's a young curator. He's one of the curators of the new triennial at the new museum that we have, which is, I think, a very interesting show if any of you get to New York. Also, I was very inspired by his essay in the catalog, Songs for Sabotage, because it is so serious and so political. And he's a young curator, and he's had a lot of attention for being like kind of a cool hipster. And I expected less, I have to say, and I read this essay and I was pleasantly surprised that he was thinking about the right things, and I think this show in New York is thinking about the right things, so I wanted us to remember that art has cultural value, and that we can mobilize it. And it sounds kind of utopian, but I do still believe in that. Now the art market. So we're all in this world. Who is artists here? Artists, okay. Any collectors? Couple collectors, okay. So there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about artworks breaking certain barriers. So we had the Basquiat, which went for $110 million to a Japanese billionaire. And then we had the Da Vinci, which was very important because it was sold in the contemporary sale. So when I started at Sotheby's, which was 2007, Hugh Hildesley, who was one of the people at the top, said to my class, he said, old masters will always be the backbone of the market. And has that changed in the past decade? Modern and contemporary is the biggest chunk of, at least of the Western markets. But they put this work in a contemporary sale, not an old master sale. Why? Because they wanted to market the hell out of it. They spent over $1 million on it, but also to target new collectors. The joke amongst some art historians was we were saying, well, 80% of it is contemporary because it's been fixed so many times that it's actually quite far from a Da Vinci. But I think the important thing about this too is, where did it go? Does anybody know who bought it? It was bought by a Saudi Arabian prince. I had guessed Qatar. And the important thing here is no museum in the West, in Europe, in America, could ever afford a painting like this, even though it's not even a good Da Vinci. So our funding systems have gone down. And the thing that is really keeping museums alive in the West, as well as in the East, I would say, is collectors and the boards of museums and individual philanthropy. So, are we in a new Gilded Age? We can talk about that. So, just to show you quickly, if you can see on the screen that there's a lot of talk about auctions, right? We hear it in the press, everybody loves to talk about it, but really the auction market is going like down and down, and the private market is going up because people don't like to announce sometimes their wealth or that things are being changed over hands. Also, if something doesn't get sold, if Salvator Mundi, God forbid, didn't get sold, that painting would be burned, as we call it. You can't sell that for another 20 years. But the important thing to note there, and this is from TFAF's art market report that they do every year, is, two important things. One is the $45 billion total of the global art industry, which is bigger than the recording industry now. So we're really, we're in a big game here. It's a big, there's big stakes now. And then if you look at the lower right, the important statistic is how much of the auction business is in Asia. And private collectors there are really driving that market and building, museums all the time. There are new museums opening. My students went last week. I went to a new museum. Every day museums are opening, and they are really in, I think, a gilded age. The other thing that's happened, of course, is that art has become intertwined with celebrity. We might say it always has been, but there's a new level where it is, in sort of the Hello magazines. So on the left, you see Sean Combs or P. Diddy with Jeffrey Deitch, and on the right, of course, Beyonce and Jay-Z. I love this picture because they're in front of Rosemary Castoro, who's a sort of forgotten female minimalist, the first wife of Carl Andre. I don't know if they knew that, but I just love that it was taken there. So how does that market trickle down to us? Like, how does collecting matter? So can we use this booming market? There's so much money in this 0.001% of the world being changed hands. How can we use that for good? Because I think about this all the time, and I educate a generation of people that I'm trying to get to think about it not in terms of just a commodity. How are patrons ensuring our culture for future generations? Are we in another Gilded Age? And Gilded Age, by that, I think you all know I'm referring to the time of the industrialists, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. And it's called gilded because when something's gilded, if you just scratch the surface, you don't see gold. So there was a lot of money being made off the backs of a lot of other really poor people. And I believe that our disparity of income in this country in particular is creating another, set of this situation. And also, how does technology police philanthropy now? So we can talk about that in a minute. So I'm talking about two collectors. So the first collector is Agee Gund. I hope some of you have heard of her. She's a museum trustee and a long-term philanthropist in New York. And Agee took a decision recently that's had a lot of press, which is that she sold this Roy Lichtenstein masterpiece, which you can see in her living room there above her table. She bought it for $30,000. She probably bought it in the 60s, maybe directly from Lichtenstein. And it was sold privately to Steve Cohen, who's a hedge fund guy, for over $100 million. And it's one of the top 15 artworks ever sold. So you might say, how does this matter to us? Well, what Agee said is she said, I'm 78 years old, and I want to do this before I die. So she's using the money, she's donating all of the money, the $115 million, to set up a social justice fund. So it's being administered through the Ford Foundation. And if any of you know Darren Walker, who's the president, he's an amazing, amazing man. And I put Darren's quote up there, which says, art has meaning on a wall, but it also has meaning when it's monetized. And I think he's absolutely right. So if you think of the fact that this $100 million is seed money for an important fund, which is going to help educate people and help cut down on mass incarceration in our country through education. And it's interesting because we all look at Agee and we see this sort of waspy white woman, but she actually has 6 African-American grandchildren. So she herself was worried about things like the fact that, 1 out of 3 black babies will wind up incarcerated. So I think why this is important too, which hasn't been talked a lot in the press, is that it puts pressure on other collectors. Because collecting is such a game of like toys and who has what, and everybody wants into the same sandbox. So she is asking other collectors to come forward and contribute money. They need another $100 million to keep this fund going. And I'm very excited about this as a great example, I think, of someone with a lot of means using the boom in the art market to do good things. And I will say, to do things that our government is not putting money into doing. The Vogels. Have some of you heard of Herb and Dorothy Vogel? I like to show them. I could have shown the Dictros too. I like the Vogels because they were working class people in a way. She was a librarian, he was a postman, and they decided that they would take her salary and dedicate it to buying art, because when she met Herb, he liked to go to artist studios. That was sort of his Sunday pastime. And they started taking painting classes, and then they decided, I like talking to artists better. So that's what they would do on the weekends. So they used a meager budget, and they would go to artist studios. The first piece they bought was a John Chamberlain, and they would buy. And I asked Dan Graham about this once, and he said, they were just such pains in the asses because they were always asking for discounts. But the important thing is that they bought over 4,000 works, and they bought when things were $50, $200. And so they amassed this incredible collection. And if you see on the left, their small apartment, which was very modest, it became like a hoarder's den. Like, it took 4 trucks to get it out. And they, importantly, didn't make money off their collection. Very altruistically, they gave it to the National Gallery. And now there is a program, if some of you might know this, called the 50 by 50 program, where out of 4,000 artworks, they give 50 artworks to 50 regional museums. And I think this is super important because one of the things that depresses me is the sort of predominance of New York and LA. And then you go to St. Louis and they have a fantastic museum, or Memphis or Detroit. So I love this program. There's a website about it. You can look into it. And I also like it because I love that they bought many times directly from the artists, and I know galleries frown on this, but you're patronizing someone directly and helping them keep their practice. And I always think, even if you have $100, you can buy a work from an artist, you can buy on a plan. Like, I think it's brilliant. Whitney has this sort of buying plan here. There are ways to do it. And don't think you're just buying something that's frivolous. You're supporting someone, you're supporting a livelihood of an artist, and you're supporting our culture, because I do not trust our current administration to treasure our culture. And we've seen what has happened in the past, from the degenerate art exhibitions in the Nazi period to what's happening with cultural artifacts in Syria, what happened in Iraq with the National Museum. It is very easy to lose a lot of culture in times of conflict. Thank God we haven't here, but... So I want to move from collectors to artists, and how has the market affected artists? Okay, so this is just a picture of Days, who is a street artist, but also now a gallery artist. He's been signed to PPOW. So how can artists who are successful use these benefits gained from the art market for a greater good? And it was funny because I asked Days, when the Jean-Michel Basquiat sold for over 110 million, I said to Days, did you ever think it would sell? He said, Kathy, I was surprised when Jean-Michel sold for 30,000. So, these artists really, Days was saying, we were stealing the spray can paints, we were sneaking out. It was really showing artworks in clubs like the Mud Club or Club 57. There's a great show at MoMA right now about Club 57 if you get to New York. But how does this kind of crazy change from being a starving artist to making a lot of money, how can that help a community? I'm going to show you three. The first is Titus Kafar. He's born 1976 in Kalamazoo, and he finished his MFA at Yale in the painting department, and he works with Jack Shainman. He's had a lot of success lately. He's done a TED Talk, which is very interesting if you have time to look him up. He's having a show at the Smithsonian, which is opening, I think, April. Anyway, Titus also teaches at Yale, and he really wanted to talk about the art market and how things work, because whenever I go to the Yale studios, artists will say to me, how do I price something? They don't teach that at all at Yale, and I respect that because they want them to work on their practice, not on their marketing, but it's a big problem for artists. How do I market myself? How do I know how to function as a professional and not get screwed over? So Titus decided to stay in Connecticut. He decided, unlike most Yale people who go back to Brooklyn or go to LA, to stay in New Haven. And if some of you know New Haven, it's very what we call town and gown. So Yale is very wealthy, and then there's a lot of outskirts that are really crumbling, and a lot of public schools that don't teach art or music anymore. So what Titus decided to do with some of his newly earned money was to buy a building. So he's bought a factory, which is the rendering of the new building is the like silvery white on the left. He's bought a factory, and he's turning it into a place called Postmasters, and it's going to be a site for residencies for 4 artists to live and work, internationally artists, and for a year, and also for a curator to come for 6 months. So every 6 months, a new emerging curator will come. And the interesting thing about this is he wants to try to build up New Haven again as not being like, we go to Yale, we get out, but to kind of build it again as a city where artists stay and can have a good career and live. And what he's also doing is, as Dan talked about, I don't know where he is, he's going to use local kids, like high school kids, to support the curator's shows. So when the curator's mounting a show, younger people are going to help her or him. And also as studio assistants. And the nice thing about this project is a lot of people are donating money. New Haven, we have a great new mayor there. I say we because I spend a lot of time there. And they're giving some bonds toward it. And also Deborah Burke, who is the first female dean of the architecture school. We have now female deans of art and architecture at Yale for the first time since Yale was established. She's designing the building for free. So that's one example where Kafar took money that he's been earning and is using it directly into a community to do something for younger people and to try to support artists. Another artist who, we hear a lot of headlines about how much it costs and how much money he makes, and it's Marc Bradford, born a bit earlier, 1961, in Los Angeles. You see him here in front of his works. Bradford is very interesting as a gay former hairdresser, and he makes a lot of work about his identity. He's made works with hair, he's painted with his hair, but what he's done is broken into this like post 1 million mark now, so that any painting is really, if you want it, it's $1 million, and there's a waiting list. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but when you buy a Marc Bradford painting, if you're not an institution, if you're a Saudi Arabian collector, let's say, or an American collector, you also have to buy half of one for a museum. So he's made this rule, which I think is super clever, to make sure that his work doesn't wind up totally, obfuscated in private collections, and also supporting museums. So it weeds out the people who just want a trophy. He wants real collectors who are going to give back. And so what Marc has done is he's created I should say Titus works with another co-founder, and Marc has done the same. He's made Art and Practice in South Los Angeles, and this is a center, and it encourages education by providing support. It does exhibitions, it does residencies, and it also has a place where foster people can meet, foster like big brothers and big sisters, because apparently there's a astounding number of people with doing foster care in South Los Angeles, and he's using this to build up South LA. And what I think is really interesting is that, you know, these artists, unlike if you think of a Donald Judd, have any of you gone to Marfa? So, you know, I look at Donald Judd and I respect Marfa. I take students there. But this is like a white man who made a lot of money, who created a sort of like Disney World down there. I mean, it's beautiful. Everyone should see it for the sheer display of the beauty. But I love that these artists are not just thinking about themselves and their friends, but thinking about how am I going to fix some social problems? And yes, art maybe can't fix social problems alone, but building a community and building some platforms to be able to work on these problems, I think that's truly important. Do any of you know Theaster Gates' work? So Theaster's born in 1973 in Chicago, and here you see him with his pottery crew. He really came out of pottery and clay. That's what he studied. His dad was a roofer, so you see a lot of paintings that use roofing, that use asphalt. On the right, you see two of his ceramic works that are made of clay, but also covered in tar. Theaster's become incredibly successful. He shows, one gallery he shows with his white cube, and again, these waiting list situations where your money can't even buy one. But what he's done, and this is actually even part of his practice. Have any of you engaged in a Gates installation anywhere where okay, so he often goes to a place, works there with a team, and makes an installation. And it also often involves music and performance. So I saw one at not the last Documenta, but Documenta before it, and I got really excited by his work. And so what he is doing now on the south side of Chicago is he is literally buying up different houses and renovating them and putting artists and affordable housing into it. But his big project is the Stony Island Arts Bank, which is a former bank that was all, you know, boarded up, that he got the city to give him. And inside of it is this incredible library of a few important things. One, record collection of jazz and soul. Also, a collection of magazines like Jet and Ebony, because he feels that this is an important part of African American culture that hasn't been properly, say, archived and studied. I mean, maybe it has in other parts, you know, other places, but not in Southside Chicago. So I'm very, you know, excited by how he's giving back as well. And the last artist that I'm going to talk to you about is Swoop. Born 1977 in New London, Connecticut, and I work a lot on female artists, so I always I have to bring in someone female, and she's doing a lot for different communities. So here you see her typical work, which is often figurative. It's what we call wheat pasting in the street art world, meaning that it's it's done before on paper and pasted up. And Swoop has also become, I mean, like many of these street artists now, they've been sort of swallowed up into the art market, and they're making a lot of money. Of course, if we think of Banksy as the sort of predominant one, the prices have really gotten a bit, out of control. Anyway, what Swoop has done is she's set up a foundation called the Heliotrope Foundation. And in this foundation, she has different projects. So right now there are 3. There's Braddock Tiles. This is a project that uses an old factory in Braddock, Pennsylvania. And if any of you know Braddock, it was one of the cities that was sort of redlined for the government will never put money back into it, and just left to be decrepit. And she and other artists to design tiles and prints there, and they sell them, and it's a form of community regeneration. The second project she does is her music box in New Orleans, which is a piece of architecture that, physically plays. And then she has the Convict Shelter in Haiti, which is housing. And one thing she's particularly interested in is responding to places where there are crises in housing and where things have fallen into a very bad state. So she picks, New Orleans after Katrina, Haiti after the earthquake, Braddock after it's been redlined. And she's someone that I really admire for how she's giving back. And also she's someone that, if you want to collect, you can get a print from Braddock tiles for $100. They sell out quickly, but she does do them pretty regularly. This is an example of the tiles she does. So you can also buy tiles online. Anyway, just small ways of supporting artists who support communities. So my last slide that I'm going to talk about is how do you collect? People ask me this a lot because I study the market. And my number one thing I always say is get to know the artist. Like, don't walk in, and you can walk into a gallery and you can look at something on the wall and say, that's amazing. But talk to the artist, find out what it's about, find out what she or he is about. And, I think open studios are great ways of getting to know a lot of artists at one time. Also, I always say buy what you love, because look at Agee Gund. I mean, you might buy a Liechtenstein and then you might buy something that fades into obscurity. So there are a lot of people in the art market now, especially hedge fund, types, who are buying to diversify their portfolio. And a lot of artwork goes into storage and we never see it again. Well, I think you should buy what you love. And if it increases in price and one day you can sell it and pay off your mortgage, that's exciting and that's great. And if it doesn't, you still have something you love on your wall. Do your research. Really do your research, because you would be surprised. You can walk around the same art fair, not Whitney's art fair, but you could walk around, say, Art Basel Hong Kong, and you could see the same artist selling for very different amounts, very similar works. So most of the time, reputable galleries will all agree on price ranges and discounts. But do your research, because it's the Wild West. Like, recently, someone contacted me and said, we have a Basquiat we want to sell. And they were trying to sell it for $25 million. And I don't buy or sell anything, so I sent it to my friend. And my friend said, listen, that Basquiat was offered to me for $20 million 3 months ago. So it's like, it's a small world, but there's no restrictions on it. It's not like we have an SEC guarding consumers. So do your research and know what you're buying and if it works. You may want to hire an advisor if you feel comfortable. Some people do, some people don't. Joining a young collectors or patrons group, I think, the kind of thing that Whitney has going on here, we have a lot of them in New York. Super way to get to know people. They organize events. But always, I say, ask for a discount. Not necessarily if you're in an artist studio, but if you're buying from a gallery, you can be sure that they think you're going to ask for a discount. Nobody buys the asking price. So if you're in even a small gallery, they will expect you to ask. And a 10% discount is standard, 20% maybe. Depending on the economy. But there are artists who will not give discounts. And I respect them a lot for that, because what they don't want is people trying to buy something just as a commodity and get a good deal. But most of those artists are the high level. But in the lower level, with the galleries, they expect you to ask for a discount. And finally, don't be put off by waiting lists. And even if you go to artist studios, sometimes they will say, like, look, I owe 5 paintings, so that's the next 5 months. And then, get on their list and say, will you make me one? Because every time I do this and I say, oh, I'll talk to you in 6 months when you have more time, inevitably the price has tripled, because I'm looking also at a lot of young artists, and prices go up really quickly. So it's almost like buy it while you can afford it, because there's so many artists that went up too quickly, and I personally can't afford it now. And I wouldn't even want to sell it if I had gotten it, but I just want the thing on my wall. So, don't be put off. If someone says, I'm really busy, just say, can I get on your list for when you have a piece ready for me, And also, you can pay on payment plans. I've done it. I'm an academic, so I'm on the payment plan with artists. That's about all I have. I hope that made some sense to you. Are there any questions or comments?